playing the sound through the headset.
Thanks, Don. Fantastic to see so many of you on today. And yeah, great intro from you there, Don. Whose data is it anyway? It could be a sort of a terrible new thing on Dave in the UK, I think. But one of the things that I want to talk to you today about is learning data. And over the last few weeks, months, and even years, you'll have all been hearing increasing amounts about big data, analytics, TinCan, and things like that in learning circles. So today, actually, I want to talk about something a little different. I want to talk about small data, or perhaps more aptly, I want to talk about personal data, because I think we've got an interesting conversation that's ahead of us over the next 12, 18 months, thinking about where does all this data lie, who controls it, and what can you do with it? So I'm going to open up actually with a quick question there. And just right now, thinking about this, answers in the chat window if you can. Do you actually care about owning your data in any walk of your life? So don't just think about learning, but think about healthcare. So, you know, your patient record, is that something that you're aware of? Is your credit record something you are aware of? It's increasingly in the news here in the UK. I don't know about the rest of the world. And then thinking also, I mean, your learning record, as a lifelong learning or someone who does perhaps continual professional development, is learning data something that you think is very important? Not really? Where do we lie?
Well, it's interesting, a variety of different answers coming back. And healthcare and credit are one thing. People may regard those as being very important. Learning another. We create, as I said earlier, a trail of data in everything we do. Our shopping creates a trail of data, and certainly that's owned by somebody typically. But Maria asks a good question back to you, Ben, which is, absolutely she cares about it, but what is owning? What does, and Steve says the same thing, what does to own the data mean? Could you just talk about that a little bit, or is that going to be something you pick up later on, Ben?
No, it's a fantastic question, and I'm not sure that there's any one answer to cover it all, because there is the concept of ownership for me means that I can do things like store, sort, and share that information in ways that I choose to. And there's one thing about owning a copy of your data, but I guess there's another thing about owning the ultimate record of your data, because you know, you look at credit ratings and things like that, and you might well have a view on how good your credit is, but if somebody else has another view on it, then that can be something quite disruptive. So there's perhaps two levels to the ownership there. One is that you get you have a degree of control over what you do with that data, but then there's probably a second level there in terms of thinking about who else has that and how else might that be used. So I think that's a really good question.
Those thoughts are reflected in the comments we've got here, because Jens, and that's Elizabeth and other people who have agreed with Jens, saying personal data should not be public or semi-public without my control. So that comes to the control issue rather than the ownership. Somebody else might own it, but who actually controls what happens to it? And certainly, I don't think, you know, we might accept that our healthcare records we don't own, but we don't want them to be public. Joanne also raises a good point. Learning records, I'd like to keep my own. Other data, I only want it when I need it, and then I want it now, which is a very good point. You know, you may not care about owning it, but you certainly want to have access to it and to be able to use it. So immediately, only on your second slide, Ben, we've already opened up a can of worms about ownership, control, and use of data. So it can only get more complex from here, Ben.
Yeah, I'm afraid it only can. But I'm really pleased to see that this has touched a nerve with some of you, because I think this is actually a really important issue, and I'm afraid to say, so close to the top of the hour, that I don't have all of the answers, but I honestly don't. I think this is something that we're going to be debating and thinking about for quite a long time. But you know, you think about the credit record thing, every time you go to a store, every time you miss a payment, make a payment, or any of these things, this is all adding to that record. And now there's centralized systems that take care of that. And now as we're starting to do learning in wider areas, and we're starting to see it be a more rounded part of somebody's role, then you know, we're creating so many activities, so many artifacts around the place, that I think it's an incredibly important question, and it's one that I would challenge you. We'll come back to it right at the end and see where we go from there. But I think if there was one takeaway from this from this, it would be to go and have a conversation later on today with your colleagues or whoever else you happen to have around, and just sort of ask them the same question, or, what does it mean to own your data, or something like that? Because I think this is something that we're really going to have to bend our heads around. So I guess what I was kind of hoping for, and what I kind of got, and I swear to you this will be my only metaphorical image through the whole slide deck, was that we are in a bit of a perfect storm at the moment. You see where I went there with the perfect storm. So I think there's a number of things coming together at the moment which mean that this topic is not only more relevant than it ever has been, but it's going to be more relevant going forward. It's going to be very pertinent. And I think there's 3 key trends, although you might disagree and come up with several more. So the first of my 3 key trends is this movement away from learning on the LMS. Now, go back a decade or so, and we used to, or I used to, maybe you guys didn't, I used to think of a lot of what we did in the organization as, you went onto the LMS to take a course of learning, and that was tracked and controlled in a central place. Now, of course, we've got 2 different things happening. Firstly, we have the recognition of informal learning and L that comes with that, thinking that actually, you know what, realistically, if we really think about this, learning is happening everywhere. And actually, it isn't the sort of thing that only occurs when we go on the LMS. That's a total misnomer. Second to that, we also have an absolute influx of technologies that the organization doesn't own. We've been thinking about bring your own device as a big trend for corporate IT, but really we're getting towards a point of bring your own learning, because actually when you have MOOC providers like Coursera, Apple with iTunes U, you have Google, and you have other products that are actually outside of an LMS, but are legitimate vehicles for either formal or informal learning. We don't get to control any of that anymore. And that's something that's happening all over the place. Learning doesn't happen on the LMS. Bring your own learning is going to be the sort of thing that we see more and more of. So we've got that as our first. Our second is actually the TinCan standard. So I won't go into an awful lot of detail about this today. There are others who know far more than I, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about this over the last few weeks and months. But TinCan, as an evolution of how we track and share data in the learning environment, is a really important step for us. Because now what I'm saying is, yes, there's a recognition that learning happens anywhere and everywhere, and TinCan gives us an open, standardized framework by which we can share information between those programs. So I can learn something on an app, I can visit something on an app, I can make a comment on a website, I can go out into real life and attend an event. And all of that we can create little bits of data around, little activity statements that can be centrally tracked, housed, recorded. So think about that now. We've got this idea of the Learning Record Store. Now, I'm sure you've been hit with a lot of acronyms around the place. The Learning Record Store is slightly different to an LMS or any of the other things there. The Learning Record Store, my personal thought when I say Learning Record Store is almost the filing cabinet in the corner that no one looks at. You don't go into the Learning Record Store to really use it, but what it is a central immutable record of everything you've done, and third-party programs will tap into that to access your data. So increasingly, organizations are going to be on the outlook for a learning record store they can call their own. And so we're going to have lots of information, way more information than we ever have before, coming back to organizations in the form of TinCan activity statements being stored on a learning record store. There is one important thing about TinCan statements. They can be understood by both people and machines. So previously, we've done a lot of work in the background of learning data that actually was only useful for computers. But actually, TinCan statements fundamentally make sense to us. The idea of Ben attended the LSG webinar is something that we can all understand, but also a TinCan compliant, sorry, misnomer there, a TinCan compliant system can understand and make sense of that. This gives us a real opportunity because it means that actually, not only might these statements be good at a really big data level, where we've got hundreds of thousands of statements and we're trying to extrapolate trends, but it could also be really useful at a really small level, demonstrating what I've done in a way that not only you can understand, but other computer systems can understand. And that's going to be hugely important for us. One final reason, so 3 reasons. My final reason goes something like this. These figures are a bit US-centric, so I apologize for that in advance. But fundamentally, people don't stay in the same role for very long anymore. Now, this has been true for quite a long time, actually. If you look back at the stats, this isn't a massive sea change right now. But statistics suggest that 91% of millennial workers expect to stay in a job for less than 3 years, and they'll, on average, have at least 15 jobs over the course of their lifetime. This means that if I've got all of this data that pertains not just to how I've done formal training, but how I've evolved as an informal learner throughout my work, then if I entrust all of that data to a single organization, chances are I'm going to have to start again pretty soon. In fact, in less than 3 years, that record is something that, to the organization, is almost worthless. There, unless you've got audit purposes, once you've left the organization, you might as well delete it. But if there's a lot of rich data there, we're going to lose a heck of a lot of stuff. I think this is a really important thing that increasingly we're going to need to take control of that data and have it for ourselves, because actually as we move jobs, as we create portfolio careers for ourselves, it's going to be really important. So 3 reasons, just recapping. First of all, we learn everywhere, not just on the LMS. It's bring your own learning time. Secondly, TinCan means we've got a standard way to acknowledge this wide array of activity and a way to track it centrally. And thirdly, I think you're going to want to access this data outside of an employer, of a single employer. I think this is really useful for you. So just let's go to another quick question here. Can you think of any more reasons why you might want to own your own data? I talked about those 3 as, the learning anywhere, the TinCan standard enabling more data, and the lack of steady employment with a single employer. But are there more reasons why you might want to own your own data? Have a think about that and bring us your comments, and I'll also answer any questions that have come up there.
Well, I'll ask you a question very quickly. Also, if we know that's the question, why else would you want to own your own data? Could you just jump back to your slide so we can see the established 3 reasons you've got? That would be a useful recap, I think, Ben. DRS asked a question, where do these stats come from, the millennial job churn stat you had on the previous slide, where you get 15 jobs in a lifetime because you're spending 3 years in each job roughly? Do you know that one?
Yes, I can send you a link at the end, but the Department of Labour Statistics, it's a US-centric measure, but the OECD ones are quite similar.
Okay, and lots of interesting thoughts coming back already to why else would you want to own your own data. Craig is saying, for your own career development and showcasing your skills for future employers. That's got to be an important one, I would say.
Yeah.
Colleagues should own their own data, supported by the organisation. Gareth wants it on his CV. It has value to me, says Rachel. And this idea of career progression is one thing that's coming through quite strongly. Hazel representing that as well, but Graham as well. But Alex talking about it reflecting a learning journal, and other people also saying this is reflecting where I've come from. I just want to have an idea of where I've been. Jen says, keep up to date and relevant and make sure data quality is good. And I do think this is an issue, Ben, that will come up. Are we going to be, if we're living in a data-rich, data-driven world, are we going to be driven by and should we be concerned by the quality of the data that's there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's obviously the thing that comes up in other walks of life, is to make sure that data is accurate. I wonder if anybody's ever issued a freedom of information request on their own organisation to get access to their learning record.
If you have done a freedom of information request in the UK, or equivalent elsewhere in the world, please do let us know. I'd like to know how quickly it came up and whether you were successful. Andrew Jacobs, just let's wrap this one up, dropped in the acronym POKE or POS, personally owned, corporately enabled. So that's a new acronym for today. Lots of great thoughts coming through here as to why you would want to own your own data. How else, asks Maria, can you give your best to your next employer? And Talia saying it demonstrates your ability to change, evolve, and stay up to date. Lots of great stuff coming through. Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, I think these are all great ones, and like any good Blue Peter presenter, I've come up with some of my own. So there's thinking about personalised learning. There's thinking about how can we personalise future learning, and I saw that from Steve J there as a sort of a big need. As a live CV or as a better CV, I think that's quite important. Not only can we give you a more thorough overview of your experience, but also if it's backed by data and it's happening automatically, then you almost create this living CV at this point that actually you don't really have to tend to, but it keeps up to date with everything you're doing. I think that's quite a strong reason from a personal now. To benchmark and compare, I think I've seen that going through there, and to help focus on your career, I've seen a lot of that, thinking about CPD and other things like that. And also, I think it's come a couple of times there, thinking about privacy concerns. That's something that's in the news a lot at the moment, and I think that probably comes back to more accuracy than anything else. But making sure that the record somebody has on you is accurate and up to date, because I think that's a really difficult one. If you haven't got that stuff up to date, then that could be a really big problem. So keep going if you have more ideas, and I will fetch back to you as we go. I'm just going to move on a little moment and think about one example of how we started to enable this to happen. So thinking about TinCan, I mentioned about the learning record store previously, the idea of a corporate central filing cabinet for data. And actually part of the movement, and it's been around the idea has been around for the last 12 or 18 months or so, has been the idea of having a personal learning record store, a personal area that you can collect data in. And so I've been quite busy with a couple of colleagues creating a free and open source version of this over the last few months, and we've called it Learning Locker. Now, I don't want it to be a sales pitch for Learning Locker, but what I do want to do is just show you how we've started enabling people to collect their own data, and hopefully it will inspire you to think about this and investigate this product, other products, and products that you might be able to make yourself. So first things first, creating a learning record store is actually quite simple. It seems like it might be quite complex, and don't get me wrong, you do need to know how to program, you do need to know the TinCan standard, but actually creating a system that can accept TinCan statements is quite simple. The standard was designed to be quite lightweight. So we did that in about 3 weeks, and you might not see this terribly well, but this is almost a bit of a view on some sort of TinCan-like things coming in where it's tracking my activity on another learning system. And we did that very, very quickly. And we quickly realized there was an enormous problem. Owning your own learning data is unbelievably dull. All you get is this list of things that you've done going backwards. And it's not a very compelling experience. You can pull out some key trends, that you happen to read most on a Tuesday, or that you prefer this website versus that website, or that you comment a lot, or things like that. And that's interesting for a moment. But actually, owning your own data seems to be deadly dull. And this, I thought, was an enormous problem. I think it's going to be one of the biggest problems we have. I think we've got a fair weight of opinion to suggest that owning your own data could be really important. But if the activity of actually owning it and having that isn't compelling and doesn't give something back to you, it's going to be unbelievably hard to persuade not just our learning colleagues, but our colleagues in the wider business that owning your learning data is actually worth your time investing in. Because if it's not worth it for me right now, people don't tend to do it. So thinking about this, we've got to introduce some context to the data that's coming in. Previously, we've got this diagram on the left half of it I talked about before in terms of thinking about the different ways in which we could get activity into a learning record store, or in this case, into a learning locker. But on the other side of having put it in a learning locker, you've really got to do something about that. You've got to be able to store it in a way that means you can access it. You've got to be able to sort it in a way that means I can bundle bits of experience together, because it's no good just having an endless stream of what you've done. You've got to be able to have some sense of direction, thinking about why you were doing this, what was the wider goal, what was the wider context. And having sorted that experience into something that makes sense for you, you've got to be able to share it. And this has come up a number of times already, thinking about how can you present the information back to the wider world or to third-party programs to mean that you can personalize learning or show your living CV. So yes, you've got to be able to do all of this in order to create a more compelling experience. I'll just show you some brief screenshots of the system we came up with. This was the idea of the learning locker, was that actually you had to organize these statements into bundles of your experience. So I have a bundle about getting to know the learning locker. I have a bundle about web user design, user experience design. I have a bundle about learning about social learning. And the idea is that for me, these are 3 relevant bundles because these are things that I'm going to do more of. So if I've got activity that's coming in from both other systems, from applications, from the web, and from real life, I personally want to be able to align them to one of these 3 bundles. Having done that, I might want to see some benchmarks, about how much I've done compared to how much others have done, or thinking about how much more I need to do in order to make some progress. One of the issues that we had is thinking that, instead of just endlessly putting in statements against a context, you really need a plan. A lot of our learners will need a steer on what good looks like, or on what a competency looks like, or something like that. So actually, we've got this notion that actually you might need to create a plan, which could be as specific as watching individual videos, or it could be as broad as thinking about, go take the course on the LMS about this, go talk to Joe Bloggs in finance about this, attend a seminar, come to the LSG group. All of these things are worthy of being part of a plan, but we've found it quite useful to have these plans as part of the bundle. And users can make these as well as you as a learning professional putting forth them. So once you've made those, you need to be able to present them back in an easy to use and simple way. So we have a creation tool that allows you to create little presentations, that allows you to do reflective statements and add comments and context to your statements. And then to publish those to the web. So actually there is an address at the bottom of the screen there. If you want to have a look at that, that's a presentation that I've made earlier. And the idea of this is that it should be really easy for me to one-click publish those statements and those activities that I want to share with other people to the web. So now this is my living CV. It shows how much time I've spent working on things. It shows the different statements that I've brought in. And we've added in little features which may or may not be necessary around things like endorsements. I quite like endorsements on LinkedIn, for example, but I often find that I've got a lot of people endorsing me for things that they've got no idea about. I often wonder how my friend from school keeps on endorsing me for e-learning. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful. It makes me look awesome. But actually, if I know that those endorsements aren't really worth so much, it's because they're not at the right level of granularity. So thinking about how can you get some peer review going into this, or thinking about how can you aggregate these statements up into things like badges and include those on your presentation, because badges could be a great way of helping to present your experience back. So you guys can explore that in your own time. There's an ability to see other people's presentations and do that in our product, but it's not hugely important. One thing that is really important is thinking about how you can get data into something like a personal learning locker. And we're in a bit of a crux here, because whilst TinCan is experiencing some decent levels of adoption, it's still early days for the standard. And so to suggest that you're going to be able to get every activity that you've done on a system spitting out TinCan statements to your personal learning locker is perhaps a bit of a stretch. So there will be occasions when you can do it. So you can use X API activity providers to push statements to the learning locker. At the moment, we've got 3 other ways to do it. One is that because we have those plans, you can use that as a source, and you can use that to tick off items as you go. Another way is to use a mobile application. We're going to launch one. Others will be launching them as well, that allows you to do things like browse the web, but from within the app. And at that point, we can just store all the data that you're doing in that particular journey back to a personal learning record store. A final way is to use a bookmarklet, and you might have seen these. These are quite popular in the TinCan world. Here's an example. So a bookmarklet is something that we can just bookmark in the browser and have it at the side of our screen. So this is just me browsing the Learning and Skills group and then calling up my bookmark. And that allows me to create a statement quite quickly about what I did there. So maybe I just read or experienced something, or maybe I've left a comment and actually I want to have that recognized back in my learning locker. So you can quite quickly just put statements in from anywhere on the web. So I've got one final bit and then I'm going to pause for another question. Our learning locker is open source, and I think this is actually going to be quite important going forward, because if you subscribe to a learning locker type piece of software or service, but you don't have the right to own that service, then we get around all the way to this question again of, what is it to own your learning data? If you don't own the software that runs and records your learning data, then do you really own your learning data? Now that's a big question, and it might not be suitable for everyone else. And I don't expect that 95% of people will not download and install an open source version of a learning locker. But it is another important philosophical point. One more thought, and then this is a question that I'm going here. I've talked about personal ownership, and we're all here as individuals thinking about how this affects us, but we also represent organizations. And this is a question that I come across quite a lot. Thinking about, is the company or is your organization ready to give ownership of learning data to its employees? This sounds like a nice idea from the individual's point of view, but is it a good idea from the organization's point of view? Guys, just chip away at that one for a moment, and I'll see if I can catch up on some previous questions.
I'm not sure we can catch up on the questions, Ben. They've been coming in thick and fast. I've been collecting them, and they are quite, I've got to say, we've got about 100 people, 104 people online at the moment. We have some very sophisticated thinking and questioning going on. I would rather not try to just cram it into a quick gap here. Let's focus here on the question we've got in hand. Is your company ready to give ownership of learning data to its employees? And then let's discuss some of the other questions that have come up at the end, because I think that it's going to take more than a minute or two to get a resolution on them.
Fair enough.
So anyway, what do we think, people? Do you think where you work, people are ready to give ownership? And Ben, when we discuss this question, can you just say exactly what you mean by ownership? Is it possible, is it unique ownership or is it shared ownership? Can you just explain briefly what you mean about that?
Yeah, I think that's up for debate. I think I mean shared ownership most of the time, or not shared ownership necessarily. I think this goes back to Andrew's phrase from earlier. I think it needs to be personally owned, but I think you can grant your organization the right to look at it in certain bits and in certain ways. Yeah. So, at the moment, it feels a lot like the organization owns the data, and I can rent it off them every now and again when I need it. I think that's the wrong way around. I think I should own the data, and I should allow my organization or other third parties as I want to access to that as I deem it fit. So I think the ownership for me we've got the whole system backwards in terms of the ownership relying on the company and then the user occasionally using it. I'm personally of the opinion that it should be the other way around. But I'm not convinced that companies as a whole, I think individuals can be persuaded of that, but I'm not convinced companies as a whole can be.
I think for me, the issue always comes down to who's paying for it. And I think if companies are paying for it, they're going to think they have the right, therefore, to own it. So reflections from our participants today. Dave says, look, if you mean the employee updates their own records, no, the culture is definitely not ready for employee updating their own records. That's true. And Phil says he's not sure that releasing ownership to individuals is manageable in large organizations. Access and control seems a way forward. So here's a question for you. Does ownership come with a responsibility to maintain the data in some way?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's why this is perhaps a huge period of education that we're in here, and I think you're going to need to see some solid examples of where individuals take ownership, take control of their data, and put it to such use that they're able to transform their lives. So we need some compelling anecdotes, some compelling stories about how learning data actually translated into change. And I think we'll get some of those at the organizational level, and that will be what a lot of people are pushing from big data and trying to track, statement activity versus ROI. But I think we need those same stories at a personal level. And so there's going to be a need for some stories to emerge before we can compel people that actually maybe this is a route to promotion, to make me more money, to make me more successful, to get to those sort of basic instincts.
Couple of reflections, and then let's move on. Carol, interesting point. Employees retain certificates. Company keeps copies for information or sharing if required. I think actually that paper-based approach is a very good model, or a very good reflection of a potential model where the employee does literally own it, but the company keeps a copy of it. Maria, though, has another excellent point. No, the company's not ready for it. We don't even have one system within the whole company at the moment. That's actually in large organisations going to be a real issue, isn't it, Ben? Never mind the theory of owning the data, we don't know where it is.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point in and of itself, because it's almost a reason to do this, because it's not necessarily, it's almost giving up on the centralized one thing to rule all and thinking, you know what, my company's never going to do this. This is too big a problem for them to solve with a system. And actually, a system is probably the wrong answer for a lot of these things. And that's kind of what TinCan's built on. It's that actually, instead of all of our systems converging, they're going to diverge. And we just need a slight bit of plumbing that runs between them to allow that to work. So actually, it might be that you're of the opinion that my company's never going to be in a position to do this sort of thing. So if I don't take ownership of it, then nobody else will. And that actually, the only way it's going to work for a very large organization is for people to start doing it themselves.
Just one more point. I think this is a reflection of a number of points that have been brought up by other people. I like Joanne's point about auto-populating data for employees, but Damien raised a point which I think is really interesting. I think only engaged individuals who have an appetite for learning would do this outside the firewall. Unfortunately, I think showing my manager my learning locker would be blocked by the organisation. I do think that Damien's point about engaged individuals who have an appetite for learning is a real point here. We're all very busy. Everyone's either doing 2 jobs or no job at the moment, in the UK at any rate. Everyone's flat out. Asking them to do one extra administrative chore on top of everything else, if that comes with the ownership, frankly, it's not going to happen unless you've got, except for a handful of people who are really engaged in it. But that's just my reflection, trying to wrap up some of the thoughts here. Let's press on with the presentation.
Yeah, I'll come back to that at the end, Don, because I'm going to leave quite a bit of time for us to discuss.
Well, there's so much to talk about. It's fantastic, but please do go on, Ben.
So I think that's a really important point. So make a note, and we shall come back. Thank you again for your participation there, everybody. One point to make is that I think this has become obvious to people in the chat window, is that actually your organization can still do this. They can still, there's a number of different models in which you can share ownership or give ownership or allow copies of, or things like that to go around the place. One of the biggest issues with the copy routine is that things go out of date very quickly. So, you know, if you've got a paper certificate or something like that, you get a new one, then you end up with version controls around the place. So making it based in data gives us the advantage of it always being up to date. And it also allows us to share things automatically. So think about this model that actually, you know, at the point of access, things don't just go to your learning locker, they might also go to the organization's learning record store. And there's no reason why that couldn't happen. You can send TinCan statements from one source to many places. So there's no reason why it only has to go to one place. I think my preferred model is thinking that actually the way it should go is this, is that it goes from your learning locker to your organization's learning locker or your organization's LRS or LMS at your behest. So if somebody says, hey, Andy, why don't you come in and show us your experience, then I'm able to share that out of my bank of experience with the organization. This is the model whereby I own it, but I let my company have a window into it. Couple of quick extra thoughts at the end of this. We'll come back to some of these big issues, but I just want to press on for a moment and think about advantages, because there are some vast and distinct advantages that come to play if you actually take ownership of your learning data. And now thinking about this from my bundles point of view, that you have a bundle A and a bundle B, so you have some bunch of experience in bundle A. If you had it in a learning locker that you were able to share that data out with, you'd be able to do lots of different things. So for example, we talked about personalized e-learning. The idea here being that, you know, if I know what somebody's experience has been before, then I can personalize future experiences to them. I can think about where their gaps might lie. What have they done really well? What are their strengths? Where do they benchmark compared to other people? So I can start to really suggest where they might go next. I can start to think about the next part of their career progression. I can also think about a wider issue there, thinking about things like recruitment and things like that. Now this gets into some sketchy territory that you wouldn't want your organization to own, but fundamentally if I'm going to get a new job and I want to expose my experience of knowing something about the TinCan API, then wouldn't it be fantastic if that data could plug straight into someone like a recruitment agency and automatically start bringing me up on job boards or on other areas and things like that. There are thousands of potential uses for this data that has the potential to transform both working and learning lives. getting to it is going to be a very, very, very big task. But it's happening. The time is now. We're seeing increasing numbers of adopters for the TinCan API, and I think this is an important piece of plumbing. This does need to happen in order for this to go forward in its current guise. There are other standards, there are other methods, but I think this is going to underpin a lot of what comes next. So keep an eye on the adopters page on the TinCan API website. I happened to get an insight from somebody at the Department of Defense over in the US that said that in the new year, those people working for the Department of Defense within learning capacities will be ordered to adopt the TinCan standard. Now, I think it's brilliant that you can order 500,000 people to adopt something like that. But I think you start to see that off the back of decisions like that, I mean, you know, we've seen so much in our industry that where the US Department of Defense has pointed, then everybody has inevitably followed. So I think we're going to see some groundswell of things coming along here. And this is why I think it's important we think about this issue now. I don't necessarily know that we're going to get to the answer. Persuading people that owning your own learning data is important is going to be really, really tough. And the biggest problem with it is that the rewards will not be immediate. That's going to be virtually impossible in some circumstances to suggest that somebody should put in 5 minutes extra effort now to reap a reward in the longer term. We know that that's a very difficult thing to do, and that actually we need to work on much shorter returns, much shorter cycles of return if we're ever going to get people persuaded that this is where you start. So a final question, and then I've left a heap of time for us to go through questions and debate some more. A final question. Has anybody changed opinion? Has anybody evolved their opinion on the learning data issue? Is learning data going to be important? Do we feel that we can be passionate enough to persuade people that owning your own learning data is important? Or is it just too big a task? Lots of good answers coming in. I will go back over everything that we've come in. We've got questions tracking for us at the side, so I will come back to that. I just want to think about this. Is it going to be possible to persuade people that owning learning data is important? Is it just going to be a side effect of large organizations using it for big data, that actually small data, personal data, will become something that we can all talk about?
Interesting. There are lots of thoughts coming up about really what's in it for me, and demonstrating, as Steve J says, the ROI, the return on investment, the value for the individual and for the large organization. Elizabeth points out the interface has to be engaging. You can't turn people off on their first click. Richard says we can persuade some but not all, and I do think that is I come back to the point I made earlier, Ben. I think that is an issue. What about the people who are just reluctant? And Richard raises this very good point. Some just want to turn up and do their job. And you know what? I don't really have a problem with that. I think that that's a legitimate way of pursuing your career. If what you want to do is turn up, make money, go home, pay the mortgage or the rent, that's legitimate. And I think that is an issue that we need to address. Are we putting too much on people's plates? Hazel says the word movement is important. You can create a movement to create a good learning culture, but it takes time. Graham says, yeah, if it provides value, if it's not time consuming. All right, so lots of thoughts here, revolving round really the payoff then between value at a personal level and effort or engagement.
Yeah, and there's lots of good points. I'm just trying to read through as you go through that. I think the movement sort of is the important one. I think it's going to be something over time. I think proving the individual ROI, what's in it for me, is key. And I think there's a number of different levels to that, and you're going to get some people that will be more evangelical about it than others. You know, we see that when you are trying to start a movement, that you're trying to do something for the very long term, and a compelling first use case is there. For me, some of the most compelling use cases of this come out of things like CPD, or as you
Yeah.
call it in the US, CPE, if I have to demonstrate that I've done 40, 50, 60, 80 hours of professional development during the course of the year, and I could automate that process, then that could be a much bigger win for me. At the moment, I think CPD is probably too easily given away. You can, write off CPD generally fairly easily by attending a conference or some other bits and bobs. It doesn't actually mean anything's changed. So I think that maybe people are getting away with it a little bit on the CPD issue here. But evidencing that in data gives you a much stronger way to do that. And you see ways where I can just have my CPD updating as I go. I think actually that might be one of the low-hanging fruit that we can go for here.
Okay, there's lots of questions I need to get through, so should we move on? Just want to raise a point here. Debbie and Phil both talking positively about e-portfolios, which I find very interesting, because I'm talking at the moment with people about e-portfolios, and I've been skeptical about them making the transition from academia to the workplace. But Debbie and Phil, if you found them working, hats off to you, would like to know more about it at some point. Please do drop me a mail. Let's press on, because there's so much we need to get through. Ben.
Cool. Have we got somewhere you'd like me to start, Don?
I'd like you to put up your slide at the end saying this is what we can do next.
This is what we can do next.
Okay.
And it says network connectivity lost the second I actually put that on.
All right. So Ben's lost his network connectivity, but it doesn't matter because the URL on there I've got, which I can put up for you anyway. Let me throw up a bunch of questions. Sorry, firstly, I have to answer a question. DRS asked, Don, who owns the data within this chat? You know what? It's never something we've ever considered. The issue is, I think it's owned by the learning, it's owned, strictly speaking, by Principal Media, that owns Learning and Skills Group. It is shared by everybody and is freely available on the internet. That's what I can say. I wouldn't go as far as to say there's a copyright on it. Don't want to go down that route. It would be
Presumably, on Adobe have a copy of it.
Adobe have a copy of it, yes, but I don't think, and you're right because they own the software. But I doubt very much if they have any. Actually, I'm not sure they do have a copy of it, because that would swamp their servers. And I clear the data off at the end of each meeting. So no, I don't think they do have a copy of it.
Okay.
You have to consciously save it. Anyway, let's move on to the bigger issue. Security. Andrew Jacobs asked, the Department of Defense, you raised them, can also organizations to gather all the data that's produced by their employees. Now, you mentioned PRISM at the beginning. You mentioned the data concerns that people have got. Is there likely to be pushback from people saying, no, I'd rather live in a data light world where my individual information is not being collected? And certainly, if I don't know what's happening to it at the end, what guarantee can you give me that it's being looked after adequately?
I think that's a fascinating point of view, isn't it? To think about, it's almost a slight extension of the freedom of information request for your own learning data at your organisation, or something like that. To say that actually, I'm not convinced that you're going to be trustworthy with this data or how it is, and that's a potentially legitimate response to being asked to do a piece of compliance training or something like that. What happens if I'm in a field where compliance to a particular standard is key to my living, and I have a chance of failing that test or something like that? Then is that result going to go out places? What's it going to go? And that's a very training and formal way of looking at it. There'll be much wider issues in terms of think less about the time you spend on an actual learning program and think more about how you do your job, because there's no reason why TinCan is limited to learning. We could use the same standard to
Absolutely.
track the projects that you deliver on, to track the ROI, to track sales, or any of those things. Is my sales data going around the place at the same time? There's a lot you can do here.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what the answer is on that. For me, the key point is that the organisation or whoever's collecting the data has to show that it is responsible and it errs in any question on the side of conservatism and caution. Oren says, owning your own learning data is a strange discussion for me. In my organisation, users are responsible for their learning data, have access to it whenever they choose to via the LMS. And for reporting, users can download a copy of all their training, which is where the process falls back a decade or two. So it looks like it is quite achievable. It may be that the barriers are more in our minds than elsewhere. What about the results? This was a topic that came up again and again during the course of the conversation. Elizabeth, Kerry, Simon all raised more or less the same point. I like the approach here, says Simon. I need to reflect a bit more on how we can widen the focus from tracking activity to what you do with it. So what people actually achieve by this learning, they're maybe running around doing lots of things, but is there any impact? I think there are two reasons for doing that. Firstly, I think it's an absolutely legitimate concern from the point of view of the learning organisation. Secondly, I think that as well as it being a legitimate thing from the organisation's point of view, we perhaps don't want to encourage people to think that activity is the end goal. And I don't believe it is in its own right. But Ben, what's your thought on this? I appreciate that this may not be something you are concerned about. It may be you're more concerned about making sure that we can collect the data. But what's your viewpoint on this?
Yeah, so I think I probably do fall into the latter camp in terms of at the moment focusing on that data. But the wider issue here for me is that if you have control of your data and I can have the ability to create a presentation, then I can start becoming really responsible, or we can start scaffolding people towards that sort of outcome. Because if you think of that presentation, well, maybe the statements at the top of the presentation were where I was triggered to a piece of activity, a legitimate, maybe formal piece of training. But later on, maybe I'm going to start linking to the things that I actually did, the reflective practice. So maybe I'm linking next to the blog that I wrote about that and how I thought about how I was going to do something different. Maybe after that, I'm linking to the presentation that I gave internally to my organization to suggest why we needed to make this change. Maybe after that, I'm linking to the data that shows the change being implemented in the organization. So I think you need to break out of the notion that whilst it is activity-based, everything can be based in activity eventually. And the presentation that I put out of my learning, very, very few statements are from a learning management system or from a formal piece of anything. One of them links to my thesis, one of them links to a TED talk that I gave, and various other things like that. So actually, I think really it should be about scaffolding that route to say, look, you might start with an activity that's a very pure learning one, but actually you can use something like a personal learning locker. And this is what people use e-portfolios for. This is why e-portfolios are great, because actually you can see the start and you can see the journey to the end. And at that point, that's very, very powerful.
Well, I would add something onto that. I think tracking activity probably is something that needs to be done. I absolutely take the point that we need to show impact and effectiveness. And this comes back to the idea of tracking wider amounts of data, or at least having it interact. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this, particularly if data is stored in the cloud, being able to very smartly link data together. And I would say that the real trick is to have one place where you're tracking the learning activity, another place where you're tracking outcomes. Actually, linking the two of them together in a causal relationship is very difficult. Somebody did a TED talk, somebody wrote something, and this was the productivity effect of it. It's very difficult to do. But you can correlate. You can say, look, the person is doing these things. This is their performance. I think that's probably as close as we can get. Actually, if we did that by itself, it would be a step forward from where we are at the moment. So I think there's a legitimate question there, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer to it. But although this is a point that Andy Waller said, he's thinking that we need to review the data alongside other data such as performance, CRM, and other activity. I think that's a good point. Craig Mackey raised a very good point, that the big blocker for him is moving away from traditional meaning of learning or training, like training means attending the classroom or reading e-learning materials, requires a change of mindset from management and in the culture. And I think that, he says, it's surely the biggest challenge we have rather than any technical issues. I think I agree with him. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. I think if you put some experts in a room to solve this from a technical point of view, in most organizations you could come up with a solution within 12 to 18 months. Might cost a lot of money, but if you really wanted to solve this issue from a technical standpoint, then you could probably do it. And in fact, you might see organizations like Rastishi in the US, one of the main TinCan guys, giving out access to their watershed LRS, saying, look, pay us $30,000 and we'll make all of your systems comply with this in various ways. So technically, it can be done. The hearts and minds game is a much wider issue, and I think it's pervasive. I think you see it in almost every one of these sorts of LSG groups that you might come to. There are elements of trying to change the mindset all over the place, and it's difficult in different parts of the world, because from my point of view, and this might be inappropriate, but this is my own personal opinion, is that in the US, for example, they are very tools focused still. And in the UK, we tend to be less tools focused. We tend to be more focused that if we need a piece of e-learning or something like that, well, we'll go and procure that. But actually, we seem to be over here in the UK and maybe in Europe as well. We seem to be less focused on the tool side and more on the continuum between informal and formal. And over there, they seem to be a bit more focused on the tools side of things. So there's different angles to it.
And let's not forget Australia, India, South Africa, Sweden, other points in Europe, who are also on the call today. Elizabeth raised a really good point. She says, look, our L&D department has to maintain a global tracking tool of their project activity. And within a very short time from its introduction, everyone is updating their records and management information is pulled from it. I think that's a really good point. Sometimes you can make it happen just by telling people they've got to do it. And I've certainly been in management positions where I've done that, and you're not popular, but guess what? It gets done. So it may be that we can move to that position. But I would agree, Craig, that for me, the concept of the classroom as the way people get trained, and after all, we spend 15 years of our lives having that idea reinforced, is absolutely probably going to be the biggest blocker to any technical implementation. What about badges? Andrew Jacobs asked, aren't badges a flexible way of maintaining our learning data? What do you think about that, Ben?
Yes, I think they absolutely could be. So a couple of things. So for those of you unfamiliar, badges, I think most commonly when we talk about badges of experience, we're probably referring to Mozilla's open badge movement as a way to demonstrate your experience with a badge that is backed by data. So, you can't just get the graphic. You have to have met some criteria in order to be afforded that. Yes, I agree. We're thinking that that actually that's a perfectly legitimate way to put something into a learning locker as well. It doesn't have to be of a TinCan standard is where we're going forwards with that. So actually, yeah, we're personally going to be adopting that big style. There are other standards like activity streams, which TinCan came out of to some extent, which are perfectly legitimate, and they're included in more places like Facebook and Google Plus and other things like that. So there's lots of different routes. I like open badges a lot. I often feel that maybe TinCan statements will be the plumbing underpinning some of those badges, because a badge tends to be contextual and quite large. A badge is something that I would get for having a defined achievement, and actually there's probably quite a lot of steps in achieving that badge. So to think that the current holy grail for that particular movement seems to be issuing open badges off the basis of evidence collected via TinCan statements.
Just on the back of that, Ben, Oren's raising a good point here. He's saying, look, I'm interested in CPE, that's continuing professional education or continuing professional development in the UK, how it's controlled in TinCan. If I can submit my own experiences, who controls the amount of CPD that should be awarded against experience? And I would say that the answer is it's the body, or it's the body one way or the other, whoever that is, that sets the award. So if it's an institute, they will say how much CPD should be given out. But there is actually a point here, Ben. If you've got a vast range of different activities coming through, who on earth is going to have the time to sift through them all and say, well, that one's worth 1 hour, that one's worth 3 days?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of different ways in which you can do this. One is, first of all, I think you should remember that the benchmark at the moment is usually low. So if I say I went to the one-day conference, I will probably put 8 hours on my CPD form. And at that point, it's unusual in my experience for that to be pushed much harder than that. So we don't have a big bar to beat. TinCan statements can contain things like time and duration spent. So actually, we can actually track to a certain extent how much time you spent doing something. Kind of interestingly, I've even started investigating how much time I could give you for writing a comment, because there are actually standard measures of how much. I can't remember what the actual phrase is, but it's not words per minute, as in just writing it down, but actually composing words per minute. There are standard benchmarks of how long people take to compose words per minute. So it's not unreasonable to think that actually, if I've got a TinCan statement that concerns a comment I made on a blog, I can know how many words that is, and I can accredit you with a certain amount of time having done that. Now that's not unreasonable. I don't perceive from a CPD point of view. You're right, Don. It's up to the accrediting body to decide what is and what isn't reasonable. But as I say, the benchmark is currently low. I think that actually going forwards, having anything in data will be an improvement. And of course, what I would hope is that actually one is collecting this data in a personal learning locker, and then it is up to the individual accrediting bodies to come up with apps or other things that are TinCan compliant and can just plug that data in. So I collect my data here, and then the Chartered Institute of Marketeers or whatever you've got there have got a facility on their website to say, check your learning locker against this, and it will be able to sift out what it thinks would be accredited or not.
I want to get one last question and then we'll wrap up. Very, very good points being raised here by, well, it was a sort of discussion between Hazel, John Paul, Oren and others, and Elizabeth, talking about the validity of data if you're entering stuff yourself. Everyone's saying, what's the quality of data if you're either forcing people to enter stuff or if there are benefits associated with activity versus actually making activity real in terms of behaviour, which is something that Fiona raises the point. Let's look at what the outcomes are rather than the activity. But just one point then, Ben, to sum all that up in one question. If there is going to be some benefit accrued to your activity of learning, what's to stop people gaming the system? What's to stop me getting my PA, who, and this is a fact, who works in Nairobi and who has my logins for everything? Why shouldn't I get her watching all the TED Talks, commenting on stuff, racking up my CPD or my activity on TinCan, but I have actually personally nothing to do with it?
Yeah, and this is a great big issue for us. I'm working on this issue with a number of educational providers at the moment because this is a real concern. There are a number of things that you can do. I'm not convinced there's a sort of a single solution. First of all, there's actual examinations, assessments, and peer assessments that you can take as a part of things that already exist. Secondly, there is a certain weight of movement and things like that means that there is a certain point at which you think it becomes more and more likely that somebody has done these things. Thirdly, you could focus on outcomes instead of activity, and those can be hard to fake. Fourthly, you can think about endorsements. You can think about having other third parties endorse activity that you've done. And go from there. Fifthly, you can think about what sort of activity you're actually going to give credit for and what you're not. And perhaps finally, the most extreme example I've seen is actual proctoring. So I know that there are certain places in the world where you can take exams at distance and they will turn on the webcam. You have to be on a laptop with a webcam, and they have banks of people sat staring at screens, making sure that it's you sat in front of your computer doing something.
Not that extreme. I think, Ben, that's something we're going to increasingly see in the future. Sorry, I was playing around with the screen there while you were wrapping up, but I need to move on. I've kept a URL tracker and an acronym tracker, thanks to Rose for the suggestion of that. So we had POC, or personally owned, corporate enabled. I also like Andy Wooler's re-quote of something. It's not the size of your source, but the size of the insight that matters. I think for me that sums up the discussion we've just been having about the difference between activity and outcome. On the left-hand side there, you've got the various URLs that Ben's been dealing with. Please feel free to copy and paste those. Everything, of course, will be available after the presentation, maybe tomorrow, certainly by Monday. Everything will be available on the Learning and Skills group. Let me just copy that URL and paste it into the text chat area so that you have it. Basically, you can be sure that you'll be able to get this recording and everything else associated with it on Monday. It's for free. It's on the Learning and Skills group. Please do come along and join the group. Our next webinars are on the 7th of November. I hope you'd agree that this has been useful. It's certainly been a bit of a mind-bending experience to me. Always is when you open the can of worms that is called data. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along and staying with us on this thought-provoking ride and providing some of the best chat I've ever seen. There's been some really good thinking going on here. People really pitching in with some great experiences, thought, insights of their own. And Rose says, please include people. I'm not quite sure, Rose, if you could explain what that means, that would be super. It was a great session, I totally agree. Thank you very much for participating. As always, I've learned a lot from everybody in the room, and thank you very much, as always, Ben. It's a safe bet getting Ben to talk. You know you're going to get something to think about and something that's going to really make you go away and dwell on stuff over your coffee. If you can stick around, please do stick around. 12 o'clock, we'll be back in the room for our second Learning and Skills Group webinar of the day. And I look forward to seeing you then. It's about how you can change your organization to be a 21st century learning organization. Hope to see you then. In the meantime, thank you very much for attending. And once again, Ben, thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.